In the year 2003, a man named Kevin Manus was living a fairly quiet and busy life in downtown Portland, Oregon. Kevin was a small business owner who had a real passion for history and old things. He owned a popular antique shop located right at the base of the Burnside Bridge. If you know anything about Portland, you know that the Burnside Bridge is basically considered the gateway to the city. It is a highly trafficked, prominent area, and Kevin's shop was in a prime spot. Because Kevin made his living selling vintage items and rare collectibles, he spent a massive amount of his free time driving around to local yard sales, estate sales, and auctions. He was always on the hunt for that next unique item that he could buy for cheap, bring back to his shop, clean up, and sell to a customer for a nice profit. It was a routine he had been doing for years, and he was very good at it. So, one day, Kevin was looking through the local listings, and he saw that there was a major estate sale happening over at a house in a quiet neighborhood. The homeowner was a woman who had recently passed away at the incredible age of 103. She had lived a long and very intense life, having been a Holocaust survivor who eventually immigrated to the United States and settled in Oregon. Because she had lived in the same house for so many decades, her home was absolutely packed with generations of belongings. Kevin knew that sales like this were absolute gold mines for antique dealers, so he woke up early, hopped in his car, and drove over to the address. When Kevin arrived at the house, he noticed that the organizers of the estate sale were doing things a little bit differently. Instead of pricing every single item individually, they were grouping things together into different lots. This meant that if you wanted a specific set of old tools, you couldn't just buy the tools on their own. You had to place a bid on the entire lot, which might include several other random items grouped with it. This was a common tactic to clear out a house quickly, and Kevin immediately began scanning the different lots to see what caught his eye. As he walked through the tables, his eyes fell on a specific collection of items labeled as Lot 29. In this lot, there were a couple of small vintage hand tools that Kevin knew would sell easily in his shop. But sitting right next to the tools was something that instantly grabbed his attention. It was a wooden box. It was about 2 feet high and 1 foot wide, made of a dark, polished wood, and on the front were 2 small doors that swung open. Below the doors, there was a single drawer that pulled out from the bottom. The most intriguing part was that a metal clasp was secured across the front doors, and it was locked shut with a small, modern padlock. Taped to the top of the wood was a simple handwritten label that just said Mystery Box. Kevin was immediately intrigued by this piece. He loved a good mystery, and he thought the box looked incredibly unique, almost like an old-fashioned wine cabinet. He decided right then and there that he was going to win Lot 29. When the bidding started, Kevin kept his hand up, outbidding a few other dealers until finally the auctioneer pointed at him and shouted that Lot 29 was sold. Kevin paid for his items, walked over to the table, and began loading everything onto a wheeled cart to take to his car. As he was standing in the driveway, lifting the wooden box and putting it into the trunk of his car, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around and saw a woman walking toward him. She was one of the granddaughters of the elderly woman who had passed away. She looked at Kevin, then looked at the wooden box in his trunk, and she said, "Oh, so you went with the Dybbuk box, huh?" Hearing that word sent an immediate chill down Kevin's spine, and his mind flashed back to his childhood. Kevin had been raised in a Jewish household, and growing up, his parents used to tell him stories about folklore and spiritual entities. In Jewish folklore, a Dybbuk is a highly malevolent, wandering spirit that is said to escape from the dark corners of the universe to possess living human beings and cause absolute ruin. When Kevin was a young boy and he would misbehave, his parents would playfully warn him that he had better behave or the Dybbuk would come get him. It had terrified him as a child, and even though he was now a grown man, hearing that word out loud in a sunny driveway felt incredibly strange. Kevin looked at the woman and asked her if she had just called it a Dybbuk box. The woman nodded and explained that her grandmother had been absolutely terrified of that specific wooden chest. She told Kevin that for as long as she could remember, her grandmother had kept that box locked up tight, and she had strictly forbidden anyone in the family from ever opening it. The grandmother had told them that a highly evil spirit was trapped inside the wood, and if the lock was ever broken, something terrible would happen. She said that her grandmother would literally spit and say a prayer of protection every single time anyone in the house even uttered the word Dybbuk. Kevin listened to this and smiled, thinking it was just a creepy, fascinating piece of family lore. It made the box even more interesting to him as an antique. He thanked the woman for the story, shut his trunk, got into the driver's seat, and drove back to his antique shop. At this point, he did not believe in curses or ghosts. He just thought he had acquired a really cool conversation piece with a great backstory that would look fantastic on a shelf. When Kevin got back to his shop, he began unloading his new inventory. His shop had 2 levels. The main floor was where he displayed his best items for customers to see. But underneath the main floor was a very large basement that served as his warehouse and workshop. This basement was much larger than the retail space upstairs, filled with long rows of heavy industrial metal shelving, old furniture, and a large workbench where he would clean and price items before bringing them upstairs. Kevin carried the wooden box down the stairs, walked through the dim aisles of the basement, and set it down on a table in the very back of the room. He turned to walk back upstairs, but as he reached the steps, he stopped. He couldn't help but look back at the wooden box. The mystery of what was inside was eating away at him. He walked back to the workbench, picked up a screwdriver, and decided he was going to open it. He didn't have the key to the modern padlock, but he didn't want to damage the antique wood of the chest either. So, he carefully wedged the flat edge of the screwdriver underneath the metal clasps that were screwed into the wood. With a slow, steady pressure, he pried the screws upward until the clasp popped off, freeing the doors. As soon as the two front doors swung open, something fascinating happened. There was a small, clever mechanical lever inside the cabinet that connected the doors to the bottom drawer. The moment the doors opened, the mechanism activated and pushed the drawer outward automatically. Kevin smiled, thinking it was incredibly cool that such an old piece of furniture had a working mechanical feature like that. But then, he looked down at the contents of the drawer. There was no gold or hidden treasure inside. Instead, the box contained a highly bizarre collection of random items. There were 2 copper pennies from the 1920s, there was a small, partially burned candle, there was a small, heavy black stone goblet, there was a tiny granite tombstone with the Hebrew word shalom carved into the front, and finally, there were 2 small locks of human hair, one blonde and one dark, tied together with a faded piece of string. Kevin picked up the items and inspected them. To him, this just looked like a very personal, sentimental keepsake box belonging to an older woman. Perhaps these were mementos of loved ones she had lost during the war. He felt a brief wave of sadness for her, but since the items had no commercial value, he put them back inside the drawer, closed the wooden doors, and pushed the chest to the far corner of his workbench. He headed back upstairs and went about his day, completely forgetting about the box. Now, Kevin had one employee at the antique shop, a young woman named Jane. Jane was an exceptionally hard worker, a fantastic saleswoman, and someone Kevin trusted completely. The very next day after Kevin had opened the box, he had to leave the shop for a few hours to run some errands across town. He put Jane in charge of the store, said goodbye, and walked out. As soon as Kevin left, Jane decided to lock the front retail door. It was still early before official opening hours, and she needed to go down into the basement to grab a few specific antique items she wanted to clean and display on the main floor that day. The basement was notoriously dark and a bit eerie under the best of circumstances. It was lit by long, buzzing fluorescent tube lights hanging from the high ceiling, but because the metal shelves were so tall and packed with furniture, they blocked most of the light, casting long, deep shadows across the concrete floor. To make matters worse, several of the light bulbs had recently burned out, leaving the back half of the basement in near total darkness. Changing the bulbs was a massive hassle because you had to climb a tall ladder and reach over fragile, expensive antiques, so Kevin and Jane had a habit of waiting until almost all the lights were dead before doing it. Jane walked down the creaky wooden stairs and made her way toward the back corner of the basement, far away from where Kevin had left the wooden box on the workbench. She was searching through a shelf for some vintage glassware when she suddenly stopped. Out of nowhere, she was hit with an overwhelming, suffocating feeling that she was not alone. She felt a phantom pair of eyes staring directly at the back of her neck. Now, Jane had been down in this basement hundreds of times. She had worked down there alone in the dark, during storms, late at night, and she had never felt anything like this before. She knew for a fact that she had locked the front door of the shop upstairs. There was absolutely no other entrance to the basement besides the stairs she had just walked down, and she had not heard a single sound. She tried to shake the feeling off, telling herself that she was just letting the dark room get to her head, but the sensation of being watched was so intense that her heart began to hammer in her chest. Suddenly, a loud, sharp ringing sound cut through the silence. It was the landline telephone, which sat on a small table right at the bottom of the basement stairs. The sudden noise made Jane jump, but it also broke the spell of her fear. She quickly walked over to the table and picked up the receiver. It was her close friend who was calling just to chat and see if Jane wanted to get lunch later. Jane held the phone to her ear and began talking, glad to have a normal human voice distracting her from the creepy atmosphere. But as they were talking, Jane heard a strange sound coming from the dark rows of shelving behind her. It was a dull wooden thud. It sounded exactly like a wooden broomstick that had been leaning against a wall, suddenly slipping and falling flat onto the concrete floor. Jane stopped talking mid-sentence. Her friend on the line asked if she was still there. Jane whispered that she would have to call her back, hung up the phone, and stood perfectly still. The basement was dead silent again, save for the low hum of the remaining fluorescent lights. Jane knew that things didn't just fall over on their own. She took a slow, deep breath and began walking down one of the narrow aisles toward the dark corner where she had heard the sound, her eyes scanning the floor for a fallen broom. She was about halfway down the aisle when a massive explosion of sound erupted right behind her. She spun around and saw that one of the heavy fluorescent light tubes had suddenly dislodged from the ceiling, fallen 10 feet, and shattered into 1,000 tiny shards of glass on the concrete right where she had been standing moments before. The sudden darkness in that section of the room made her panic. She didn't care about the broom anymore. She just wanted to get out of the basement. Jane turned and began walking quickly back toward the stairs. But as she rounded the corner of a metal shelf, a heavy, solid oak chair that was sitting on one of the middle shelves suddenly flew off the rack. It didn't just slip. It was launched horizontally into the air, landing with a massive crash right in the middle of the aisle, completely blocking her path to the stairs. Jane let out a terrified scream. There was absolutely no physical way that chair could have fallen like that on its own. It had to have been thrown. In her mind, she was convinced that a violent intruder was hiding in the shadows, waiting to attack her. She vaulted over the fallen oak chair, her boots sliding on the dust, and sprinted as fast as she could toward the stairs. She scrambled up the wooden steps, her heart leaping into her throat, and reached the heavy metal security gate at the top of the stairs. This gate was used to lock the basement up tight at night to protect the expensive antiques from thieves. But when she grabbed the handle and pulled, the gate didn't budge. It was locked. Jane screamed in absolute horror. She knew that this gate could only be locked from the outside using a physical key. She was the only one in the building, and she had left the key upstairs on the counter. How was the gate locked? She began desperately shaking the metal bars, screaming for help, hoping that maybe Kevin had returned early and had locked the gate by mistake without realizing she was downstairs. As she was shaking the gate, she heard the sound of more fluorescent bulbs shattering in the darkness below, one by one, moving closer and closer to the stairs. The basement was plunging into pitch darkness. Jane pulled out her cell phone with trembling hands and dialed Kevin's number. Meanwhile, Kevin was driving back to the shop only a few blocks away. He saw his phone lighting up on the passenger seat and answered it. Immediately, he was hit with a wall of hysterical screaming. Jane was crying so hard he could barely understand her, but she kept repeating that someone was in the shop, that things were breaking, and that she was trapped. In the background of the call, Kevin could hear the distinct, terrifying sounds of crashing metal and shattering glass. Kevin floored the gas pedal, sped through the city streets, and pulled up to the front of his shop. He unlocked the front door and rushed inside, bracing himself for an active robbery or a hostage situation. But when he stepped into the retail area, it was completely silent. Everything was in perfect order. Not a single item had been moved. He ran to the back of the store and reached the basement gate. He was shocked to find that it was indeed locked. He pulled out his keys, unlocked the gate, swung it open, and looked down the stairs. The lights below were completely out. He turned on his flashlight and cautiously walked down the steps, calling out for Jane. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he found Jane sitting in a chair next to the phone desk. She was staring blankly into the darkness, completely pale and trembling, her eyes wide with shock. Kevin looked past her and saw the absolute devastation. Heavy furniture had been pulled off the shelves, antique glassware was smashed to pieces across the floor, and the broken glass from the light bulbs covered everything like snow. Kevin asked her what happened, but Jane could barely speak. She whispered that she didn't know, that things had just started flying off the shelves and falling from the ceiling on their own. Kevin's adrenaline was pumping, and as he looked around the empty, ruined basement, a feeling of deep suspicion began to grow in his mind. He walked through every single aisle with his flashlight, checking every corner, every locker, and every potential hiding spot. There was absolutely no one else down there, and there was no other exit. He knew Jane had the only other key to the building. Kevin walked back over to Jane. He looked at the massive amount of damage, which was going to cost him thousands of dollars, and he asked her a question that he would later say he regretted deeply. He asked her if she had done this herself. He thought perhaps she had suffered some kind of mental breakdown and had destroyed the shop. Jane looked up at him, her fear instantly turning into white-hot anger. She stood up, looked him dead in the eye, told him to go to hell, and walked up the stairs. She walked out of the shop and quit her job on the spot, never to return. At the time, Kevin was convinced she was guilty. He had absolutely no idea that the strange wooden box sitting on the workbench in the corner had anything to do with the chaos. A few days later, the air had cleared a bit, and it was Kevin's mother's birthday. Kevin and his mother had always been very close, and they had plans to meet at the antique shop before heading out to a nice lunch to celebrate. When his mother walked through the front door of the shop, Kevin greeted her with a big hug and told her he had a special birthday present for her. He walked over to a table, picked up a beautifully wrapped box, and set it down in front of her. His mother sat down in a chair and began unwrapping the paper. Inside was the polished wooden box with the 2 doors in the bottom drawer. Before Kevin could explain what it was or tell her the fascinating story of the estate sale, the telephone at the back of the shop began to ring. Kevin told his mom to hold on for just a second, and he walked away to answer the call. While Kevin was talking on the phone at the other end of the store, his mother was left alone with the box. She decided to open the doors. A few minutes later, Kevin hung up the phone and walked back toward the front of the shop. As he got closer, his heart dropped. His mother was slumped over in her chair, her face completely pale, her eyes wide and filled with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She was staring intently at the open wooden box. Kevin ran over to her, calling her name, but she didn't respond. She was completely paralyzed. She couldn't move her arms or legs, and when she tried to speak, only unintelligible sounds came out of her mouth. She was having a massive, life-threatening stroke. Kevin frantically dialed 911, and within minutes, paramedics rushed into the shop. As they were stabilizing her and loading her onto a stretcher, Kevin's mother was trying desperately to communicate with him. She couldn't move her body, but she could move her eyes. She would look directly at Kevin, then flick her eyes over to the wooden box on the table, and then look back at Kevin with a look of pleading terror. She did this over and over again, trying to tell him to get that box away from her, but in the chaos of the medical emergency, Kevin didn't understand. He thought she was just disoriented. It wasn't until his mother was safely in the hospital and the doctors assured him that she was going to survive that Kevin had time to sit down and process what had happened. He remembered the way she had looked at the box. He remembered the sheer terror in her eyes, directed not at her own physical state, but at the wooden chest. And then he started putting the pieces together. First, the granddaughter at the estate sale told him the box was cursed. Then, the very day after he opened it, his basement was completely destroyed by an unseen force and his trusted employee was driven out in terror. Now, the exact moment his mother opened the box, she suffered a near-fatal stroke. Kevin was not a superstitious man, but he was a logical one. The common denominator in every single one of these horrifying events was the box. He decided he wanted nothing more to do with it. Kevin brought the box back to his shop, set it on a display table near the front entrance, and put a very low price tag on it. He just wanted it gone. Within a few hours, a young couple walked into the shop, saw the unique wooden cabinet, and bought it. Kevin felt an immediate wave of relief as he watched them walk out the door with it. He felt like a massive weight had been lifted off his shoulder. But that relief did not last long. Just 2 days later, Kevin was working in the back of his shop when he heard the front door open and close. He walked out to the showroom to greet the customer, but the room was completely empty. There was no one there. But as he looked down at the floor near the entrance, his jaw dropped. There, sitting on the rug, was the wooden box. Kevin walked over to it, his hands shaking. Taped to the top of the wood was a folded piece of notebook paper. He unfolded it and read the handwritten message inside. It said, "This has an odd darkness about it." The couple had apparently brought it back, left it on the floor, and fled without even asking for a refund. Now Kevin was truly terrified. He didn't want the box in his shop for another second. He grabbed it, threw it into the back of his car, and drove to his house. He lived in a quiet suburban home with a detached garage and a secure storage locker in the backyard. He placed the box inside the storage locker, locked the heavy padlocks, and went inside, hoping that locking it away outside of his living space would keep him safe. That night, Kevin went to bed. He fell into a deep sleep, but soon he began to have a highly vivid, terrifying nightmare. In the dream, he was walking through a beautiful, sunlit stone courtyard. He was holding the hand of a woman who was a close, trusted friend of his. The atmosphere was incredibly peaceful and warm, and he felt completely safe. But as they were walking, the woman's grip on his hand began to slip. She started to pull away from him. Kevin tried to tighten his grip, but he found that his own muscles were locking up. He couldn't move his legs. He was frozen in place. The woman slowly drifted away from him, her face turning blank until she vanished into a dark, shadowy corner of the courtyard. Kevin was left standing alone in the center of the stones, unable to scream or move. Suddenly, out of the dark shadow where the woman had vanished, a figure began to emerge. It was an old woman. She was wearing a tattered shawl over her head, and her face was cast down so he couldn't see her features. She began to walk toward him. Her movement was strange, a slow, shuffling gait. As she got closer, Kevin felt an overwhelming sense of cold and dread washing over him. When she was just a few feet away, she slowly raised her head. Kevin gasped in his sleep. The woman's face was completely rotting. The skin was peeling away from her skull in wet, gray clumps, revealing the yellowed bone beneath. She had no eyes, just dark, hollow sockets. She raised her decayed hands, reached out and grabbed Kevin's face, her fingernails digging deep into his skin, and began to peel the flesh from his cheeks. Kevin woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, his heart beating so hard it hurt. He sat up in bed, gasping for air, realizing it was just a dream. He got out of bed, walked into the bathroom, and splashed cold water on his face. He looked up at his reflection in the mirror, and his breath caught in his throat. There, on his neck and shoulders, were deep, dark purple bruises. They looked exactly like finger marks, as if someone had grabbed him with immense force while he was sleeping. Kevin tried to tell himself that he must have thrashed around in his sleep, or that he had somehow bruised himself earlier in the day and hadn't noticed. He went back to bed, but the moment he closed his eyes, he fell right back into the exact same nightmare. The courtyard, the rotting old woman, the agonizing pain of his face being torn away. He woke up again, screaming in the dark. This time, when he checked the mirror, his entire back and arms were covered in painful, fresh welts and bruises. Kevin knew he was losing his mind. He couldn't keep this thing in his house or his yard for another day. He sat down at his computer in the middle of the night, opened eBay, and created a listing for the box. He didn't want to lie to whoever bought it, so he wrote a highly detailed, honest description of every single terrifying event that had occurred since the day he bought it. In Missouri, 2 college students named Sam and Brian were sitting in their apartment, browsing the internet. They were both fascinated by the paranormal and loved reading about haunted objects, urban legends, and ghosts. When they stumbled upon Kevin's eBay listing for the Dybbuk box, they thought it was the most amazing thing they had ever seen. They assumed it was a highly clever marketing stunt, but they were so entertained by the story that they decided to pool their money together and place a bid. They won the auction, and Kevin immediately packaged the box and shipped it to Missouri. A few weeks later, the package arrived. Brian was still at his college classes, but Sam was home. He eagerly brought the cardboard box into the kitchen, sliced it open, and set the wooden chest on the kitchen table. A little while later, Brian came home. The moment he unlocked the front door and stepped into the apartment, he was hit with a horrible, overwhelming stench. He would later describe it as the smell of stale, stagnant urine and rotting meat. He covered his nose and walked into the kitchen, where the smell was so thick he could almost taste it. He saw Sam standing over the wooden box. Grinning, Brian asked him what that awful smell was, and Sam just laughed and said it was the smell of the spirit. They joked about it, not taking it seriously at all. Sam even set up a personal blog online where he promised to document every single thing that happened in their apartment now that they owned the famous Dybbuk box. For the first 2 weeks, nothing happened. The boys threw parties, showing off the box to their friends who would laugh, drink beer around it, and even throw trash inside the open drawer. They treated it like a complete joke. But then, the atmosphere in the apartment began to change. It started with their electronics. Sam's brand new laptop suddenly crashed, and when he took it to a repair shop, the technician told him the hard drive had been completely melted from the inside, which was physically impossible. Then, both of their wristwatches stopped working. No matter how many times they replaced the batteries, the gears would simply lock up the moment they walked through the front door of their apartment. Their video game console refused to turn on, but when they carried it over to a friend's house, it worked perfectly. The kitchen toaster began burning bread to charcoal the instant it was plugged in. These minor inconveniences soon turned into something much more terrifying. In the middle of the night, the light bulbs in their apartment began to explode. They wouldn't just burn out, they would shatter with a loud bang, showering the rooms with glass. They went through boxes of replacement bulbs, but none of them would last more than a day. The apartment was constantly dark, then came the insects. One afternoon, Brian walked into the living room and saw a dark, moving carpet on the floor. Thousands of massive black bugs and flies had crawled out from the baseboards and the drains, and they were all marching in a straight line toward the wooden box, crawling inside the cracks of the wood. The apartment became so infested with bugs that the boys had to spray poison daily, but the insects kept coming, always circling the box. But the worst part was what happened to Sam. Within a month of receiving the box, Sam's hair began to fall out in massive clumps. He was a healthy young man, but he was rapidly going bald, and he began to suffer from a terrifying, non-stop hallucination. No matter where he was, whether he was in class, driving, or sitting in his dark living room, he could see a dark, shrouded figure of an old woman standing just at the edge of his peripheral vision. Every time he turned his head to look directly at her, she would vanish, but the moment he looked away, she was back. Sam became so sleep-deprived and terrified that he couldn't bear to be alone. He began sleeping on the floor of Brian's bedroom, but even there, he would wake up in the middle of the night and see the shadow of the old woman standing right over Brian's bed. The boys realized this was no longer a joke. They needed to get rid of the box immediately. They put it back on eBay, and it was quickly purchased by a man named Jason, who was the director of a medical museum at a university in Missouri. Jason was a man of science, but he was also deeply interested in the psychological aspects of urban legends. He had been following Sam's blog and wanted to study the box himself to prove once and for all that the stories were nothing more than a mass hysteria event. Jason received the box at his office. After his staff had left for the day, he set it on his desk, got out his camera, and began to document his examination. He took high-resolution photos of every angle of the wood. He used a black light and discovered traces of organic wax spilled all over the top, which suggested it had been used in some sort of candlelit ritual. Then Jason sat down, opened the 2 doors, and watched the drawer slide out. He stared at the pennies, the hair, and the stone. Nothing happened. The room remained quiet and still. Jason smiled, feeling vindicated. It was just a box. He closed it up and set it on a shared table in his office, planning to use it as a fun conversation piece for his colleagues the next day. But the very next morning, the curse seemed to activate with a vengeance. Every single computer in the museum office crashed simultaneously. The university IT department spent hours trying to fix them, but couldn't find any logical explanation. The light bulbs in Jason's office began to pop and shatter, just like they had in the boy's apartment. Within 3 days, every single one of Jason's coworkers who shared that office came down with a sudden, severe respiratory illness. They began coughing up blood, and they begged Jason to take the box out of the building. Jason, still trying to remain logical, decided to put the box in the back of his pickup truck, which had a heavy lockable cover. He drove home, parking the truck in his driveway. He didn't want to bring it inside his house because he didn't want to worry his wife and son, but he figured it would be safe in the truck overnight until he could figure out what to do with it. That night, Jason went to sleep. A few hours later, he woke up to a pitch-black room. He tried to roll over to look at his alarm clock, but he couldn't move. He was completely paralyzed. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, but his limbs felt like they had been poured full of concrete. The room was illuminated by an eerie orange-yellow glow coming from the streetlight outside their large bedroom window. As Jason lay there, his heart pounding in his chest, he heard a sound. It was the sound of footsteps. They were coming from the staircase just outside his open bedroom door. They were slow, heavy, plodding footsteps. One by one, they climbed the stairs. Jason watched the doorway, unable to turn his head. Through the orange light, he saw a shadow stretch across the floor. A figure slowly stepped into his bedroom. It was an old woman, wearing a dark shawl over her head, her face completely obscured by the shadows. She didn't look at him at first. She slowly shuffled across the foot of his bed, her movements silent and unnatural. But when she reached the far side of the bed, she suddenly turned her head and stared directly at Jason. She didn't just walk to him. She let out a silent, unnatural snarl and rushed toward him with terrifying speed. She bent over him, her decayed face inches from his, and she drove her long, bony fingers directly into his eyes. Jason let out a silent scream of absolute agony. Suddenly, his body unlocked, and he sat up in bed, screaming at the top of his lungs. His wife was holding him, trying to calm him down, telling him he was just having a nightmare. Jason was shaking, his face wet with tears. He touched his eyes, relieved to find they were still there, but they felt incredibly sore and irritated. The next morning, Jason walked into the bathroom and looked in the mirror. He gasped. The whites of both of his eyes were completely filled with blood. The skin around his eyes was bruised and swollen, looking as if someone had physically gouged them while he slept. Now, Jason was terrified. He realized the stories were real, but he didn't want to throw the box in a dumpster because he was terrified that some innocent garbage collector or child would find it and inherit the curse. He decided to leave it in his truck for one more day while he researched how to properly destroy it. That evening, Jason was sitting in his living room watching television with his young son. The room was quiet. Suddenly, his son stopped looking at the TV. He pointed a finger at the space behind Jason's chair and asked, "Dad, who is that old woman standing behind you?" Jason froze. He slowly turned around, and for a split second he saw her. The old woman in the shawl was standing right in his living room, staring at his son. Then she vanished into thin air. Jason grabbed his son, screamed for his wife, and told them they had to leave the house immediately. They piled into his wife's car and drove away. Jason explained everything to his terrified family. They decided that Jason would drive his truck to a vacant rental property they owned a few miles out of town. He carried the box into the dark basement of the empty house, locked it inside a secure room, and ran back to his car. That night, Jason looked up Kevin's contact information online and called him. Kevin, who had been feeling immense guilt for selling the box, agreed to help. He promised to go back to the house of the Holocaust survivor to find out the truth about what was inside the box. The next day, Kevin drove back to the house where the estate sale had been held. He knocked on the door, and this time, an elderly Jewish woman named Sophie answered. Sophie was the cousin of Havala, the woman who had passed away. When Kevin introduced himself and mentioned the wooden box, Sophie's face went pale. She looked at him with deep sadness and asked him if he had opened it. When Kevin admitted that he had, Sophie sighed and sat down. She explained that she and Havala had grown up in Poland before World War II. In the 1930s, when they were young women, there was a massive cultural craze surrounding spiritualism, seances, and talking to the dead. She, Havala, and their friends thought it was just a fun, thrilling game. They had created a makeshift Ouija board by stitching letters onto a heavy blanket, and they would sit around a table, holding a heavy metal pendant suspended by a chain, asking questions to the spirit world. For months, nothing happened. But one night, during a storm, the pendant suddenly went completely rigid. It began to spin with immense force, pointing to letters on the blanket over and over again, spelling out 3 words: "Release me, release me, release me." The girls were terrified, but they soon realized they had made contact with something highly malevolent. They began to suffer from horrific nightmares, unexplained illnesses, and a feeling of pure evil in their home. They realized they had summoned a Dybbuk. Desperate to protect themselves, Havala's mother, who was highly knowledgeable in Jewish mysticism, devised a complex ritual to trap the spirit. They used a simple wooden wine cabinet, lined it with sacred items, including locks of their own hair to bind the spirit's focus, a small tombstone to symbolize its death, and a goblet for ritual wine. They performed the ceremony, lured the entity inside, shut the doors, and locked it with a padlock. Havala had kept the box locked for 70 years, carrying the secret to her grave, hoping the evil would remain trapped forever. Kevin immediately relayed this information to Jason. They contacted a local group of Orthodox rabbis who agreed to perform a formal, highly dangerous binding ritual. The rabbis went to the vacant rental property, entered the basement, and spent hours chanting prayers and performing ancient rituals over the wood. They managed to successfully seal the Dybbuk back inside the box, securing it with new spiritually blessed locks. Today, the Dybbuk box is hidden away in a highly classified secret location, buried deep where no one can ever find it. Both Kevin and Jason have stated that they have not experienced any further paranormal activity since that day, and they hope that the box remains buried forever so that no one else will ever have to face the terrifying entity trapped within the polished wood. In the country of Ukraine, in the cold industrial city of Novomoskovsk, a young girl named Oksana Malaya was born on November 4, 1983. Oksana was born into a world of extreme poverty and neglect. Her parents were severe, violent alcoholics who spent their days and nights in a constant drunken stupor. They had absolutely no interest in raising a child, and they viewed Oksana as nothing more than a burden. In the freezing winter of 1986, when Oksana was only 3 years old, her parents were inside their small, run-down wooden house, drinking heavily. At some point during the night, Oksana was left outside in the backyard. The temperature was well below freezing, and the wind was howling. Oksana, shivering and crying in the dark, tried to get back inside, but the heavy wooden door was locked tight. Her parents, completely passed out from the alcohol, did not hear her cries. Instinctively, the toddler began to look for any source of warmth to survive the night. In the corner of the yard stood a large wooden kennel where the family's pack of mongrel dogs slept. Oksana crawled across the frozen dirt, squeezed herself through the small opening of the kennel, and curled up among the sleeping dogs. Incredibly, the dogs did not attack the small child. Instead, they seemed to recognize her vulnerability. They pressed their warm, furry bodies against her, keeping her alive through the freezing night. The next morning, Oksana's parents woke up, but they did not even notice that their 3-year-old daughter was missing. And over the next 5 years, Oksana would continue to live in that kennel. She completely abandoned the human world, and the pack of dogs fully accepted her as one of their own. During these highly critical formative years of her development, from age 3 to age 8, Oksana had virtually zero human interaction. She did not learn how to walk on 2 legs, she did not learn how to use utensils, and she did not hear human speech. Instead, her entire reality was shaped by the dogs. She learned to run on all 4s, supporting her weight on her hands and knees, moving with incredible speed and agility. She learned to clean herself by licking her skin, and she would only eat raw meat or scraps of food she found on the ground, growling at anyone who came near her meal. When she was happy, she would wag her imaginary tail, and when she felt threatened, she would bare her teeth and bark ferociously. She had completely forgotten that she was human. In her mind, she was a dog. It wasn't until the early 1990s that a local resident happened to be walking near the woods behind the family's property and saw something that stopped them in their tracks. They saw what looked like a wild animal running through the trees on all 4s, but as they got closer,